Hello and welcome to today's episode of Ask the Expert. In today's episode, I was speaking to co-directors from the Centre for Gender in Politics, Jamie Hagan and Maria Adriana Diana, about the work of the Centre and how gender in politics matters today. Good afternoon, Maria and Jamie. It's good to have you here with us. Thank you very much for taking the time out to participate. Jamie, can I ask you to start off, please, by giving an introduction into yourself and your work, and perhaps explaining a little bit about the work of the Centre on a wider level?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for holding this session for us today. I'm Jamie Hagan, a lecturer in international relations. And my work focuses primarily on thinking about queer questions in gender, peace, and security. So I began my work looking at the women, peace, and security architecture and asking questions about where LGBTQ voices are in responding to post-conflict, and just really thinking about how looking through a queer lens changes how we see politics, but certainly conflict, and really reimagining peace. So in that sense, the Centre is a space where feminist scholars such as myself and Maria can come together to bridge scholarship, but also work with civil society actors and think through the challenges in international studies today. And certainly at Queen's, a lot of that emphasis has been on looking at conflict studies, has been looking at different visions for peace. And we also highlight policy engagement and a real intentionality around connecting with people in the community, right? Being, it matters that QUB is in Belfast, right? So how do we make sure that people who are part of feminist organizing, people who are part of thinking through how gender matters in politics today, how do we make sure that we have people from the policy side, from the community, and also, of course, the brilliant feminist scholarship that we want to, engage with and really lift up. So it's been a fantastic way for me to continue my work looking at queering women, peace, and security, but really building bridges with feminist scholarship across different issues in politics today.
Thank you, Jamie. And can I hand over to you now, Maria, please, to introduce yourself as well?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Andy. Thank you for organizing this section. Yes, my name is Maria Adriana Diana, and I am the co-director of the Centre for Gender in Politics here at Queen's with Jamie. I am also a lecturer in international relations in the School of HAP, history, anthropology, philosophy, and politics. So my own work, it's broadly situated in the field which is called feminist security studies, which is basically an emerging field of research that looks at gender dynamics in the context of conflict, post-conflict transformation, peace building, and so on. So my own work has looked at basically analyzing different experiences, mostly focusing on the experiences of grassroots organizations, women's organizations, and feminist groups, and in contexts that are shaped by conflict, international intervention, and peace building. So I focused on the context of Northern Ireland, for example, but I've also conducted some research in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I've also tried to kind of, try to bring these two different contexts together to see what can we learn from the different experiences on the ground. And I'm also interested in, just like Jamie, in examining the women, peace, and security agenda, which is now becoming an international framework which has emerged in now the past 20 years as the dominant framework that we have internationally in order to address the diverse impact of conflict and conflict transformation and peace building on women, men, and people of all genders. And so, for example, I've looked at the ways in which certain institutions, such as the European Union, for instance, are incorporating gender concerns in their operations, such as peacekeeping operations and more generally in security practices. So this work really feeds into the activities that we do at the center. So the center is essentially a space where we can reflect on these dynamics together with other colleagues within Queen's, together with perhaps speakers that we invite, colleagues from different institutions, and crucially with students. We both teach international relations, we both teach conflict and post-conflict transformation and security, and many, these are very popular themes, and students are very engaged with these topics, and we have an increasing number of students that are particularly interested in thinking about gender and in relation to these wider processes. And of course, because we live in Northern Ireland and we're based in Northern Ireland, we're very lucky to have insights from civil society organizations, from feminist activism, and the wealth of knowledge that they have accumulated throughout the peace process and throughout, navigating quite complex political processes. So the center really is kind of creating a hub where we can bring together students, researchers, as well as the amazing feminist and LGBT activists that we have in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Maria. Folks, at this point, I would like to invite all attendees to field their questions. However, just to get the ball rolling, I have a question about the centre. For many people may not be aware that the centre is relatively new. It was launched in November of 2019. Why was that the right time for the launch of the centre? And sort of further to that, why is a centre for gender in politics needed at the moment?
Will I start?
Do you want to start, Maria, and then I'll jump in after?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so yes, we launched the center in November, and I also would like to say that the center is also a result of previous work that was already existing in Queen's. So I would like to mention the fact that we had our colleague, Professor Yvonne Galligan, who was for many years was based at Queen's University, and she had created the Center for the Advancement of Women in Politics as a space that was actually drawing attention to the underrepresentation of women in politics in Northern Ireland, and also globally. So in many ways, the center is kind of a continuation of this legacy, and we decided to launch it in November. Well, it was a little bit of luck in the sense that both Jamie and I started working together, and there are certain affinities between our work and between and also across the kind of teaching that we do. And so we wanted to continue the legacy of having a space where gender concerns about the gender stereotypes and gender inequalities that shape politics and international relations more broadly. And we also wanted to kind of follow up on the legacy that we already had in the School of Up. So we were very happy to launch the center. It was an important time in Northern Ireland because, as we know, we had seen a number of developments. We had seen, after moments of political deadlock, we had new devolved institutions that were restored. And so this was an important moment politically for Northern Ireland. We also had important developments in relation to LGBT rights and marriage equality. We had important developments in relation to reproductive rights. And so it was really an important time for us to launch the center and to reflect on the kind of developments that were happening in Northern Ireland in relation to gender politics. And so we launched the center with a roundtable of feminist activists, LGBT activists in Northern Ireland, and we wanted to reflect on how they've navigated, some of the challenges that were presented because of on the one hand, the legacy of, the kind of incomplete peace process, the kind of political deadlock that we're facing, and as well as some of the resistance that was in place for the full realization of gender equality and reproductive rights and LGBT rights. So launching the center in November was really an opportunity to reflect back on the road traveled by feminist activists, by LGBT activists, as well as to think about what we can do in the future and how can we reflect on how feminist groups, LGBT groups navigate quite complex political terrain using the examples and the insight that we have in Northern Ireland. And Jamie, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just add a couple of things. I think that so from the dimension of activism, it's been incredibly clear how important gender is to thinking through everything from, of course, all the different ongoing grassroots activism in Northern Ireland that Maria has already highlighted, but also with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's been a real emphasis on also drawing attention to Black women's experiences. And there's, a robust history of Black feminist scholarship that we both draw on in our scholarship, but also that is mobilizing this call for intersectionality. So it's a moment where students want to see attention to intersectionality in the classroom. We have an increase of students who are really reaching out. It's very exciting to see PhD students who want to study. There's a real call for support of studying gender at the master's level, but also the PhD level. So we want to create a space to network and support this. So that's been a really exciting opportunity here with this. And also I wanted to point to the shift in foreign policy to this new feminist foreign policy idea. So we're also linking up with what is feminist foreign policy? What does that look like here? How do we connect up with the ongoing conversations in international studies and bring a perspective from Northern Ireland, but also connect up with other feminist scholarships. So those are three other dimensions that sort of, and not to mention it's the 20-year anniversary of Women, Peace and Security, celebrating that in October. So it's a very exciting moment to be reflecting on where have we, what successes have been made, what the next steps might be. So it's been a really exciting moment to connect up and continue these conversations with activists, thinking through the politics of today, and also, of course, working with students to think through this as well.
Thank you, Jamie. Just a further question, sort of following on from a couple of points that you both made there. How does gender activism actually intersect with other social movements? Black Lives Matter is a very current one, but I'm also thinking potentially about things like climate change as well. I suppose it must depend on the sort of social issue in hand, but I suppose the wider question is sort of, how does it intersect with every social sort of movement? And using Black Lives Matter as an example, could you explain further about their relationship?
Sure, I can respond to that and then hand it over to Maria. Absolutely, right? So we introduced in the undergraduate class on gender a week on climate change, actually, this year. Maria introduced that. And because gender it's important to talk about women. Actually, often women aren't talked about when we think about conflict, when we think about politics. It's still very frustrating that thinking about women is actually often something that's maybe that's an afterthought or a tick box exercise. So absolutely thinking about gender and the dimension of where are the women is still incredibly critical. But also, as we talk about gender, it's about power dynamics. It's about privilege. It's about recognizing what that then means in terms of which members of the community will be most impacted from, say, climate change, how an intersection of being a Black woman matters when you think through police brutality, when you think through, in the work that I do, how does it impact a bisexual woman differently to be, you know, looking for basic direct services in post-conflict spaces, and what does that mean for humanitarian emergency response? So there's very specific policy impacts once you start thinking through, okay, transgender women also exist in this space, so what does it mean in terms of like health direct services, right? So, and that would cut across every single issue, right? And I think one of the really exciting, I keep using this word because it is as devastating as the moment is with COVID, there's also, I think people who've been doing this work, highlighting gender, highlighting queer experiences, because of the crisis, in some ways, maybe are having the opportunity to share how they respond to crisis. For example, the mutual aid responses that I'm seeing, where communities who've been kind of left on their own, not really supported by the government, when it comes to housing, when it comes to being able to access jobs, have just found ways to mutually support one another. And that has really taken off in the US and the UK, and I imagine other places, but those are the spaces I'm more familiar with, the mutual aid networks. And this is something that grassroots, this is something that, you know, queer communities have been using, because if you can't actually access the system, then you find another way. And so in that sense, I think when it comes to responding to crisis, when it comes to understanding a different vision for peace, there's always something to be learned and a different vision to be had by centering gender, by thinking through, okay, what do LGBTQ organizations have to say on this? And so in that sense, I think whether it's climate change, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's thinking through peace and security issues, you know, thinking about obviously healthcare. I mean, a queer lens on thinking about healthcare and basic services is just very different, because you understand the different privileges and priorities that the very different disparities between people who are cisgender and those who are trans, for example. Maria, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I can just add something that I always say to our students when I try to explain intersectionality, which is the idea that we do not navigate society, we do not inhabit society simply as men, women, or LGBT individuals, right? Our identity is also shaped by other, you know, by other social categories, which determine, you know, whether we have access to resources, whether a policy is gonna affect us in a specific way. And so paying attention to these intersections becomes really important for movements that strive for social justice, because it basically draws attention to the fact that very often there are certain dynamics that intersect and which may have, you know, a very unequal impact on different individuals and different communities. And so, you know, gender never works in isolation. Of course, we have a problem of gender inequality, but we also need to pay attention to the ways in which gender then intersect, let's say, with class, or intersects with race, because these will have important implications for the everyday life of certain, you know, certain communities and certain individuals. And so we always go back to, you know, to some of the key thinkers, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who was actually the founder of Intersectionality, that basically tells us that if we really want to think about social justice, we need to have a much more complex lens that is able to address, you know, it's not that there is a problem of gender here, that there is a problem of race there, that there is an LGBT problem there. You know, our society is complex, and very often those paths intersect, those systems of power intersect, and this has important implications for the everyday life, whether we are thinking about climate change, whether we are thinking about political representations, whether we are thinking about healthcare. We need to really pay attention to these, and therefore it's not a surprise that now, you know, even climate change movements are actually, drawing attention to these intersections, that social justice is now very much linked to these insights, because it is a way of actually capturing the different positionality of communities and individuals, and trying to make society and policy making more responsive to the power relations that there are and to the inequalities that are reproduced throughout society. So this is something that we really strive to bring to the fore of our teaching as well. And students are very much receptive to these kind of concerns and to these analytical processes.
Thank you both. Touching on the points you've made, there's a question here that's come in. Do you think current political leaders are having a positive effect on gender equality and wider gender activism?
Maybe I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think it is important, the politics of representation is important. It is important to have leaders and to have a diversity of leaders. So by all means, I think it is important to have role models. It is important to see a wider representation of society in our leadership. And so, yes, by all means, we need to have a more diverse representation, and we need to have, it is important that we have, for instance, women in leadership position. However, this is not the end, this is very often is not enough. We also have to have important politics that actually address those kind of gendered and intersectional inequalities that are in place. So this is what a feminist analysis tells us, that having more representative democratic institutions and more representative leadership position is certainly important. But if this is not coupled with a feminist analysis and an analysis that is going to address some of these inequalities that I've just mentioned, we're not going to see the kind of change and the kind of inclusion and social justice that the feminist movement and other social justice movement are striving for. Now, it is true that at the moment, for instance, in relation to the COVID, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there is some evidence that women leaders have been quite positive, and certainly this is encouraging. But I would also but this is not only a matter of presence, it's also a matter of the kind of politics and the kind of policies that leaders, put forward. So, yeah, it is important, but I will say that is not the end all in all of what feminist politics should be about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in. So I think there's a couple of different aspects of this, right? You have the question of what it means to get a woman in office or in a position of leadership, but then there's the question of accountability and whether, of course, not all women are feminists, right? Like, let's also remember that. And also, anyone can be a feminist. So it's actually, is the representation feminist is the more powerful question, and that's where the question of accountability comes in. There's also I think Sarah Ahmed's work really shows us that so much of it comes down to the institution as well, right? Because you can be in a space calling for feminist action, feminist change, but if those with privilege and power don't move and give that up, then we've had people calling for feminist change, for example, in higher ed for decades. And some of these people leave because they can't stay in the institution. And you can see this, I think, I'm very curious about this in the space of women, peace, and security, where the agenda was really structured to, it's about a gender perspective, but a lot of the measurements, the way that we end up instrumentalizing a way to follow up on these resolutions that call for a gender perspective is to count women. And that's important, and we do need to track that. but again, just because a woman's in a police force doesn't mean she's going to be feminist, right? And that's challenging and hard, right? And I think that's why having these difficult conversations with feminist leaders who've been thinking about this for a long time across scholarship, civil society engagement, and then of course the critical insights from students who are thinking about this too. It really helps us trouble what it means to try to action these feminist initiatives and changes. And I think when you do see the accountability start to roll in a way that is intersectional, I think that you can look at the U.S. VP, recent Kamala Harris nomination. Twitter has kind of been really going at this nomination from a lot of different directions, and so that there's a lot of histories wrapped up in that too. So I think it's a really important question that we have to keep asking from different perspectives, and we have to bring the history of what actually happens when women and feminist leaders are put into certain institutions, so that we can sort of map the possibilities for change, or actually abolitionist thinking, which is something that we're actually seeing more mobilization about, and is something that queer and feminist movements have been also thinking through for some time, and it's interesting to see that get more serious thought right now.
Thank you. There's a question that's come here, and I think it could be taken in one of two ways. The question reads, should gender equality be a concern for men? Now, that could, the person that's asked that could either be meaning, is it and I use inverted commas, a threat to patriarchal order, or should it be a concern, gender equality be a concern for men in terms of the actions that men can take, if that makes sense?
For me, it'll be short and sweet. I mean, the answer is actually yes on both. It should be a threat to the patriarchal order. Yes. I certainly imagine feminist and gender analysis a threat to the patriarchal order, the very violent patriarchal order. But also, I mean, we already have fantastic evidence of what it means to have I mean, it's necessary, actually, for men to be involved in feminist movements and activism. To my earlier point about you can have an amazing feminist leader, but if there isn't shifting and the giving up of power, then, I mean, a feminist leader can only do so much if there's not actually the rest of the institution shifting and mobilizing and giving up power. But I did want to say a final point on this is that, again, bringing a queer possibility or queer hope to how we think through this, it's always both and. So I do think in most of the folks that I've talked to who are doing feminist and queer work, they have a vision of, yes, maybe being in more patriarchal and even racist institutions, but also continuing to work at the grassroots level and having a both and, where you're operating in different spaces at the same time with different understandings of what like a feminist future might look like. So even when you may be thwarted in one space that is really restrictive for feminist change, you may actually be able to be doing something so basic as giving direct aid to someone who needs housing. And that's actually a radical, I mean, that's again like linking back up to these mutual aid initiatives. Actually giving $100 to someone who's losing housing, £100 who's losing housing, is a huge change in their life. So even if you're like facing these real frustrations in institutions, you might also be donating to a mutual aid institution. So that was linking back to the other question, but I'll hand it over to Maria to respond to how do we think about men when we think about feminism.
Thank you, Jamie. I mean, absolutely, I agree with what Jamie was saying. I think the answer is yes to both. That we do, gender equality is about challenging the patriarchal order, and the burden of challenging this should not be placed only on on gender minorities. So we need a collective effort. And so I think that this can happen in different ways. Sometimes, the contribution of men can be very simple: let go of certain spaces, let go of certain power, create the space whereby feminist claims and claims about wider gender equality can happen. So work as an ally. I think this is very important, because also we need to pay attention to who gets visibility from doing feminist work, and we need to be, we need to be a little bit careful so that, feminist work and gender equality work does not become a replication of certain hierarchies and certain systems of power. So by all means, yes, it should be a concerted effort. Yes, it should be a challenge to the patriarchal order, and yes, it shouldn't just be on the burden, a burden of gender minorities to do this work. I think it is a responsibility that we should all have if we really think about gender equality in relation to political transformation. And this doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge the work of women, feminist activists and LGBT activists who have been a driving force of political transformation over the years. And we have examples of this in Northern Ireland, as well as globally. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question we have here is how does gender politics differ in Northern Ireland from either Ireland or the rest of the UK, or is there more or less parity?
Good question. Should I maybe answer?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, go for it.
Well, gender politics, I mean, when we think about Northern Ireland, we cannot forget the history of, the conflict and the history of the peace process. And so there are very specific dynamics that have shaped, the role of women, the experiences of women during the conflict, the spaces where women were able to mobilize and to both together and within different communities. So there are certainly, all of these dynamics have added, additional challenges that the feminist movement in Northern Ireland had to face. And so the fact that, we have a history, decades of violence, we have the fact that very often the conflict and the relationship between the two communities take over, perhaps understandably to some extent, the political space, also meant that questions of gender equality perhaps and questions about feminist politics were tended to be relegated to the margins. For instance, even when we think about the histories of the conflict, there is still a tendency to think that gender doesn't matter, when actually we know that men and women and LGBT individuals have experienced conflict in different ways. And we know that a lot of the community work and emotional work, caring work, sustaining the community work was done by women's organizations. We know that women participated in the conflict in different ways, not only through political organizing, but also were involved in the conflict. And this kind of aspect has not received as much visibility as it should have. And we also shouldn't forget that actually the history of the Northern Ireland peace process, it was quite remarkable, because we saw the creation of the Women's Coalition. It's often the story of the Women's Coalition is often regarded as a key example of, women coming together and being able to participate in the peace negotiations, which is not something that happens, very often. This doesn't mean that, so there are all of these complexities make set Northern Ireland apart, because as we can imagine, and we can appreciate, gender equality, gender inequalities are present and replicated globally, but they're always inflected with specific contextual and historical dynamics. And so when we think about Northern Ireland, we cannot forget that. We cannot forget the history of mobilization, the gendered experiences of the conflict. And we also cannot forget the fact that, even though the peace process was particularly important, and even though the negotiations of the agreement actually led to specific provision for gender equality, actually a lot of those provisions, have not been fulfilled, and that there are still concerns about addressing the gendered legacy of the conflict. There are still challenges for the full realization of women's political inclusion, women's gender equality, understood broadly, and social justice. And so these, I think, are the dynamics that we need to keep in mind when thinking about gender politics, feminist politics in Northern Ireland. There are very complex dynamics that the feminist movement had to navigate. But at the same time, these also resonate with experiences of other communities that have experienced conflict.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple quick points. And I think being newer to Northern Ireland, I think I'm also really interested in the way that Northern Ireland, especially around LGBT rights, is sort of presented. Because it's been, I would argue, fairly convenient to say that Northern Ireland is the most backwards place to be for LGBT rights. I mean, actually, that was like a headline I saw when I was Googling around before moving. And, I think the reality is most places do a terrible job of actually documenting homophobia and transphobia. It really depends on the way that different, across the UK, there's really deplorable access to healthcare for trans people. And so, I think the way that the history of the conflict then becomes part of the global narrative about Northern Ireland is something to be careful about, and something that we can also see at play in other spaces of conflict, and is something that we're also interrogating in like development language when we talk about international relations that have to do with racial hierarchies, but also just colonial legacies. So realistically, that's all part, there's a gender dynamic to all of that. And in some ways, looking at the way that the story of LGBT rights in Northern Ireland is sort of being written right now is an interesting perspective into that. Because I'll just say that certainly, there's an LGBT staff network at QUB, and that's not the case across all institutions in the UK. That's not to say that that's the same thing as having there's complexities to like what the reality is for queer people in their day-to-day experiences. But the truth of the matter is convenient narratives around conflict and post-conflict can sometimes erase the realities of the communities that are creating space for queer lives, and also looking at activism around abortion and all of that. So I think that to bring it back to the connections and bridges that we work to make at the center, there can be some really dangerous lazy narratives that can sometimes be perpetuated without actually linking into looking at the day-to-day lives of people in different spaces of conflict, and that's troubling and complicated and all of that. So we're by speaking with the people who've been at the forefront of doing this grassroots work, you get more of a nuanced perspective into it that doesn't sort of like fall into easier narratives in global politics that we see perpetuated all the time. And again, we're seeing with COVID and which places are handling it well and things like that. And there's a gender dimension to all of it. So, but yeah, Maria hit on basically some of the core concerns when we're thinking about how Northern Ireland is different when we're talking about the global politics here.
Can I add something to?
Absolutely, Maria.
I also wanted to add that at the moment we are seeing. I think that Northern Ireland is also a particularly important context, because what we see here, it's a feminist movement that is quite inclusive, which is not replicated elsewhere. At the moment, we see the emergence of trans exclusionary rhetoric that sees basically a kind of like a clash between feminist movement and the transgender movement. And actually in Northern Ireland, we have examples of, the a much more inclusive way of thinking about feminism, of bringing together, concerns about trans healthcare and so on. And so I think it is.
Why do you think that is, Maria? Why do you think that's different in Northern Ireland?
That's a good question. It could be very interesting to do a research project on that. I mean, I think it could be also because of these are just, I'm just trying some ideas. It could be because of a history of the feminist movement itself. In Northern Ireland, as elsewhere, the feminist movement is not a unified movement. There is a lot of compromise, and there are lots of tensions. If you really want to be inclusive, you need to be very aware of, not reproducing generalizing ideas about women, let's say, or not to generalize ideas about women's experiences, of LGBT experiences, and the history of the feminist movement here shows that these concerns about navigating different positionalities, navigating different political perspectives was very much at the core of how the feminist movement has emerged, because obviously women feminist activists were not separated from the conflict and from different positioning that the different communities and women activists within them may have. So it could be that the history of navigating the diversity of positioning in relation to the conflict may have led to a more inclusive approach. It seems to me that a lot of feminist activists here are also very much concerned with social justice, and obviously, if you think about social justice through the lenses of intersectionality, then you don't see. You cannot think about your movement as trans exclusionary. That will run counter the principles of intersectionality itself, in my view. But again, I think that this could be a really interesting project to to develop in order to understand why. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come in which kind of move us on from the sort of wider issue to the centre within the context of the university. And one of those questions is, to what extent does the centre work with colleagues across the university? I suspect what is meant by that is it purely a centre for research, or are there support mechanisms available there for staff and or students to access?
I mean, I can speak briefly. I mean, it's early days, but we are certainly developing. We're linking the center up with we're aiming for a master's program in gender, right? So then, in long term, we would really love to have fellows and be able to continue to support researchers. But in terms of across the university, absolutely, especially with the Queer at Queens initiative, which hosts events every year. This year it will be in November. So we're currently putting together a program that will include people who work on the arts, who work in theater, but also bringing in social science perspectives so that we can have this interdisciplinary discussion and these types of events, because and also outburst events have been bringing this sort of looking at the arts, also looking at social sciences and thinking about politics together, because some of the most incredible feminist work really does bring together that scholarship that is across these different spaces in the university. But of course, we're also looking to connect up with the student union. I'm the UCU Equalities Officer, so inevitably there'll be some collaboration and connection with thinking through just equalities work in general that's happening at Queen's. So I think you can sort of see that with the group of people that we brought together at the center, there is an understanding that, of course, there's a gender dimension to thinking about law, just as there's really incredible, feminist scholarship about theater. So I think with the events that we're hosting, the idea is that the events would be appealing to people who, certainly aren't, not just people who study international relations or politics, right? I think it's fair to say that the events that we host are appeal across the university.
Yeah. Can I maybe add a couple of things? We have also recently, we were very happy to receive support from our faculty and from the ESRC to actually help build a new initiative, which is called Gender at Queen's. And so we have created now a website, which basically is the first point of call for anyone interested in linking up with different people who are doing gender-related work within the university. So, for instance, we also have a gender network, which was created by our colleague Yasin Brunger and Gillian McNall. And that has been doing really fantastic work in providing a space for professional development and a networking space for postgraduate students, not only within the law department, but more widely within the university. And so, for instance, this is one of the initiatives that we are drawing attention to. Of course, we have the gender initiative within Queen's that is more connected, for example, to creating mentorship opportunities for academics within the university. And so, again, the website is kind of creating links to all these initiatives. And crucially, our aim is to really use try to create a hub whereby all the people from students to researchers to anybody who's working at Queen's who may be interested in thinking about gender equality, about gender, feminist politics can actually come together. And so ideally, we'll also use these networking opportunity to strengthen our links with civil society. And also to make sure that then, the kind of conversations that we are having at Queen's also reflect the important work that is happening, not only in Northern Ireland, but more widely. There are important discussions at the moment in terms of higher education, in terms of linking, how do we transform, how do we make our education system, more representative? How do we make it, how do we undo certain practices that affect, for instance, not only women, but also gender and ethnic minorities. And so, these are also some of the avenues that we would be exploring in the future to think about some of the ongoing discussions that we have about, making higher education more, not only more inclusive, but also more critical about certain power relations that we reproduce in university as well.
Thank you. Thank you both. We're coming towards the end of the session now. And to close, there's a final question that's come in, which is, are there particular ways in which we, and by we, I think the person is probably referring to students, staff, alumni, etc. Are there ways in which we can become involved or support the work of the centre?
Yes, absolutely. So we have a website and we have a presence on social media. All of our events are open to the public. Both Jenny and I are also very open, in meeting people around university if we want to discuss initiatives. We have done so, for instance, with our students. So, we will be very happy to actually engage with anybody who's interested in really feminist politics and transformative social justice. So by all means, we have an email address. Both Jenny and I are on social media. We will be very available and interested in actually hearing ideas, and if we can facilitate events, if we can support them in any way, or if we can collaborate across the university as well as beyond, we are absolutely, we will be delighted to hear from anybody who is interested in being part of the center. It's not an exclusive space, by all means. Actually, quite the contrary. We want really to expand what we do and to get more people on board.
Absolutely. I would say that, for example, the Queens on Gender page, we're currently, we're very open to people who want to, add to the website to speak about their projects that they're involved in. Those who, I mean, that was part of the initiative for the ESRC project, because there are so many people who are doing really interesting work that it actually can be lost. So we're really working to highlight that. And also people have different visions about what it means to work on gender, what it means to work on feminism, and we are not the arbiters of what that is, right? So we're interested in highlighting that. And certainly we have a blog where we're highlighting student work, and we're interested in continuing to do that. People should feel comfortable, dropping a line if they're interested in that. And also in these curious times, it means that we're able to collaborate and organize events differently than we would be able to perhaps other years. So we're currently, working out our schedule of events, which definitely stay tuned for that. But they will be accessible online because they will be recorded. So that is something that, and actually we've had events that in the past, our launch event is a podcast which you can listen to. And we had an event where we had some folks for Alliance for Choice that were talking about how the new abortion regs are rolling out in Northern Ireland. So that's something that, definitely link up with, check out, and we're always interested in feedback and more collaboration. So please don't hesitate to be in touch. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and then we have our website with our blog.
Brilliant. Well, Jamie, Maria, thanks once again for participating today. That's been an absolutely fantastic session. And thank you to all the attendees who have submitted their questions as well. We've tried to get through as many of those as possible. However, if anybody does have further questions about the centre or wants to find out more, then please do get in touch with them via social media or through their website. The next Ask the Expert session will be taking place on the 27th of August on how to get that graduate job. So please also tune in for that. But just to reiterate, thank you to everybody for taking part today, and enjoy the rest of your day.